Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week we have a variety of pieces of news. This regards vaccines for the CCP virus, evidence of metals being deposited in the human brain in certain pathologies, bizarre animal discoveries, and news about the fireworks that many Americans are very desperately waiting for come July 4th. Let's start with vaccines for the CCP virus. NovaVax is a company we've mentioned previously, most recently for their weight loss drug. They are, however, a rather large vaccine manufacturer. They've been trying to get their vaccine on the market now for a while, and it would appear that they are going to publish results from a large-scale study. The study would indicate that it has a greater than 90% efficacy against both the original CCP virus strain and the new virus strains. These new strains were the big concern when it comes to vaccinations. Would current vaccines be able to handle the mutations and keep on going? Would they need to be updated? Would they need to be changed entirely? Unfortunately, it's been rather hit and miss with all the vaccines. Some have proven to be efficacious against some of the strains, others against all of the strains, and some against only the original. The NovaVax vaccine has certain advantages over a number of the currently available options. That is, it does not need to be stored at extremely low temperatures. In fact, it can be kept in somewhere between a standard fridge at 2 degrees Celsius and a freezer at -8 degrees Celsius. That means you can distribute it using any standard available mass logistics network, whether that's aircraft, shipping containers, and trucks with frozen storage on board. It's all the same insofar as its ability to be transported. That makes it far more desirable with regards to distributing the vaccine to less well-developed nations. Going now from vaccines to other pathologies. Alzheimer's disease has been one of the long-running problems. Alzheimer's involves the development of plaque within the brain. These plaques are made up of protein bundles that interfere with the ability for neurons to communicate with each other. Over time, the number of plaques increases, and the degree of impact on the brain also increases. How these develop hasn't always been clear, and for that matter, still isn't to some extent. There are certain drugs that have been approved in various ways to try and mitigate or treat it to some extent, whether this has been things like dopamine to reintroduce dopamine into the brain to mitigate what's been lost, or more recently, treatments to dissolve those plaque bundles. The plaque bundles though themselves are yet another interesting phenomena. As mentioned, they're generally made from protein, but it's not just protein. It's iron and copper, and that's unusual. In general, the human body doesn't have a lot of iron, and it's pretty much all found within your hemoglobin, bones, or liver. Copper is scarce by comparison to iron, and there's very little iron in the body. To give some comparison, to make an iron sword, you would need all of the blood from 2,352 people. That's about 2,250 grams. Copper is a fraction of that in an individual. The reason the body has such small amounts of these metals, and for that matter others, is that it can be extremely dangerous. Iron and copper, along with other metals, have the ability to become radicalized, and there's a certain irony in using that term, but it's known as a radical oxygen species, and it causes oxygenation of various things it interacts with. This leads to the things becoming damaged. In the case of iron, that can be neurodegenerative disorders. Similar things have been observed with copper, with certain diseases becoming quite apparent when there's enough copper in the body to be visualized in the iris of the eye. That's where this study comes in. By using X-rays, researchers were able to not only identify clumps of the protein bundles in the brain, but what metals were within them. What they discovered was not only the copper and iron, but copper and iron in elemental form. This means iron bonded to iron and copper bonded to copper, effectively creating small metal deposits, similar to what you might find with, say, a nail. This meant that you had solid masses of metal forming in the brain and within the plaques themselves. That's a problem, and, as we've mentioned, we already know these metals are closely associated with neurodegenerative disorders. We already know that the elemental form of these metals can create radical oxygen species, and this in turn means that you have a constant source of possible damage being found as a solid mass within the brain. Going now from clinical news, or at least clinical news in terms of humans, to bizarre animal research. Scientists decided that they would freeze-dry mouse sperm, send it into space for 6 years, and see what happens when it comes back to Earth. Surprisingly, the sperm was fertile and led to otherwise healthy baby mice. This is odd, to say the least. When you send things into space, you need to protect them very carefully, and that's because you don't have the Earth's atmosphere. The atmosphere protects most living organisms from most of the radiation. This radiation is the same sort that can cause all manner of mutations and, at least in the case of humans, cancer, sterility, and other complications that are generally adverse to life. The Japanese researchers involved had samples brought back to Earth at 9 months, 2 years 9 months, and 5 years 10 months. Overall, there wasn't a significant difference between those that had been stored in space for an extended period and those on Earth with regards to fertility. There was, however, slightly more damage to the genetic sequences of those stored in space for longer, which, as we've mentioned, should come as no surprise given the background radiation and space radiation as a whole. You may wonder what set this whole experiment off, and unsurprisingly, the Japanese view the Earth as likely to undergo apocalyptic events, whether environmental or otherwise, forcing people off the planet. They wanted to know what effect being in space would have on the ability to reproduce, something to which they now have the answer. Something that looks like it should come from Japan, or at least anime, but doesn't, is this rather disturbing creature. No, this doesn't come from the movie Teeth. Instead, this is a real-world deep-sea animal found in 2011. It was discovered about 500 meters below the ocean level, about 200 kilometers east of New Caledonia in the Pacific Ocean. It's a kind of starfish, a very distant relative to the starfish you might be familiar with, but still a starfish. This one was discovered living on the sea floor, and the species as a whole can be found all around the globe. There are 8 arms, and each arm is about 10 centimeters long. The arms are covered with rows of hooks, spines, and teeth. Yeah. The creature appears to be able to trace its lineage back to a common ancestor with other starfish about 180 million years ago, about the same time as Jurassic Park would be set in. As terrifying as that starfish is, this might be even more terrifying for some people. Those are cobwebs. Lots and lots of cobwebs in Australia. And, of course, it has to be Australia. Where else would you see a horrifying image like this? The spiderwebs cover a large area in part of southern Australia called Victoria. And, well, the spiders are behaving weirdly, and they're behaving weirdly because the area is flooding. Their spiderweb set up like this allows them to escape the flooded out soil, and that then lets them keep on living. And, yeah. We would make a joke about burn it with fire, but it might be a little too soon for that. The more environmentally conscious researchers who know about this are strongly advising people not to spray them with bug killer of any kind. They're feeling empathy for the 8-legged creatures and advising anyone that they're simply trying to escape being drowned. We suspect that most people aren't going to pay much attention to that particular bit of advice if they're not fond of spiders, let's say. Our final piece of news this week regards fireworks, and two things regarding them. One is there's likely to be a pending shortage come July 4th. This is due to all manner of issues in importing fireworks to America. Shipments have been delayed by the CCP virus, among other events. This means that the stocks that are currently available are likely to be it, at least for a time. That also means that unless you have a supply on hand, are going to buy it soon, or aren't particularly interested, you may not have a chance to get fireworks at all this year. There is also an increased demand overall based on last year's numbers, where more people were buying fireworks to use at their home. This last point is particularly noteworthy. It is well evidenced, both by numbers and from the simple knowledge required, that your average person using fireworks is a generally bad idea. In 2018, there were 9,100 fireworks-based injuries reported from American emergency departments. Of these, more than half occurred in the 1-month period around July. That is 5,600. Of those, nearly 200 were from the July 4th date itself, all within 24 hours each way. This is because the vast majority of people either don't use fireworks correctly, don't know how to use them correctly, and, in some cases, don't know how to act safely around them, leading to injuries such as burns, projectiles causing wounds, and in some rare and severe cases, the light of the firework being activated at a very close range to someone's eye, causing damage that way. Explosives, burns, and eye damage all are associated with fireworks around the July 4th period, and it explains why there are so many injuries around that time and why they cluster around July 4th. Injuries, though, are the least of the concerns, with 5 people dying from injuries in 2018, to exemplify just how stupid people can be. In one case from 2018, an 18-year-old male had attached a mortar-type launcher to their head via taping it to a helmet, and then igniting shells while it was on their head. One of these becomes stuck in the tube, and as a result did not launch. It did, however, explode on his head. This is why we strongly advise that you only let people who A. know what they're doing, B. are competent, and C. aren't an idiot set up and use fireworks. Preferably someone who is qualified or trained in dealing with explosives. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.